From legendary filmmaker Tobe Hooper comes the 1974 classic that captured the imagination of audiences across America with one macabre question: who will survive, and what will be left of them? The infamous, the one and only, the mighty first chapter of one of horror's oldest and longest-running franchises, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. This is one of those horror films that is, for lack of a better phrase, a part of my DNA, a part of my very being. Just one of those movies that is just baked into the core of who I am as a person. Not to say that I'm a flesh-wearing, chainsaw-wielding madman who ruins expensive doors and keeps chickens in bird cages, but more so one that has been with this film since, pretty much, his infancy, and that I've almost literally been watching this film for my entire life. And that isn't an exaggeration. Say what you want about my upbringing, but I promise you that I have never killed anyone that didn't absolutely deserve it, and my flirtations with cannibalism amount to less than 3 incidents. So again, watching horror movies doesn't turn good little boys and girls into serial killers or psychopaths. I think the first aspect of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre that becomes apparent from the very first shot of the film is that the aesthetic being presented here is one not unlike a documentary film. Gritty, voyeuristic, and very fly-on-the-wall in nature, as if we're experiencing the events of the film for real, versus seeing said events through the artsy glass of cinema, if that makes any sense whatsoever. The film feels so real and so raw and visceral that as a child, I remember thinking that I was actually seeing what really happened to these people in real time. 1, because the film told me that these events were true, and 2, because I wasn't really old enough yet to understand reenactments, acting, etc. I literally thought I was seeing what actually happened on August 18th, 1973, even though we all understand that none of this actually happened and was all inspired by and based on the true story of Ed Gein. But that's besides the point. I think this is one of the reasons this film remains so frightening for me today, and was especially frightening to me as a child. The movie was intriguing, fantastic, and had me glued to the screen every time I watched it, but the experience was always abrasively frightening nonetheless. Again, I thought what I was seeing was real, so Leatherface, as he appeared in the film, was an actual person who actually existed, which shook me to my core, and definitely made him the true horror of horror movies for me. And this is why he remains so scary to me today, because that childhood feeling of, this is real, never really dissipated, even though we know everything about this movie, from the cast and crew, to the production, to the behind-the-scenes exploits, problem with distribution, all of that stuff. That unnerving feeling never really goes away. It still feels like a legitimate snuff film. As far as I'm concerned, the film is, always has been, and always will be, one of the scariest films ever made, if not the scariest. The story of the film is exceedingly simple, and rightfully so. It isn't bogged down by elusive plot twists, too many characters, or an unnecessary amount of backstory, and these attributes only help the film. After hearing reports of grave robbing and grave desecration occurring at a local cemetery their grandfather is buried at, siblings Sally and Franklin Hardesty decide to visit the graveyard and make sure his grave has been left in one piece. Upon leaving the cemetery, they decide to visit the old Franklin place, which is a rotting and abandoned Hardesty family homestead, still standing in the middle of nowhere. On the way, they encounter a lack of gasoline, a very strange gas station clerk, and a psychotic hitchhiker who manages to slice Franklin's arm before being kicked out of the van. After finally arriving at the house and exploring the surrounding area, Sally and her friends soon fall afoul of a crazed and deranged family taking up residence in a neighboring farmhouse, a family we later come to know as the Sawyers. The horror begins with Kirk and Pam, who encounter Leatherface himself while searching for gas, approaching the Sawyer home after noticing their gas-fueled generator outside. In one of the most frightening sequences ever put to film, we not only catch our first look ever of the terrifying Leatherface, but we see Kirk and Pam dispatched in some truly unforgettably uncomfortable ways. The film already had a surreal and mean-spirited atmosphere about it, but this scene really cemented and solidified that, and we as an audience really knew what we were in store for upon seeing it. Once more, this didn't feel like a movie. These felt like real people, and Leatherface felt like an actual person. Absolutely shocking, horrifying, and spine-chilling. Soon thereafter, Jerry meets a similar fate. Franklin and Sally venture into the woods to find their friends. Franklin is dispatched by a proactively murderous Leatherface, trying to figure out who all these intrusive hippies are, and after encountering the gas station clerk from earlier yet again, Drayton Sawyer as we come to know him in later films, Sally soon finds herself beaten unconscious, gagged, and tied to a chair in the midst of some kind of frenzied late-night dinner at the Sawyer house, joined not only by Drayton himself, but also the hitchhiker, and of course, Leatherface, now dressed in very unnerving dinner attire. After a horrifying encounter with Grandpa, who is actually still alive, contrary to what Sally assumed when first coming upon his supposed corpse, where the old man drinks her blood and attempts to relive his glory days by killing her with a sledgehammer, Sally manages to free herself, jump through the window, and make her escape in the wee hours of the next morning. This infamous chase sequence eventually closes out the film, with the hitchhiker being run over, Sally making her escape, and Leatherface dancing angrily in the streets, flailing around with his chainsaw in rage-driven defeat. Surely one of the most profoundly unnerving sequences to ever end a horror film, and an abrupt one at that. It simply cuts to black in the middle of Leatherface's tantrum, seemingly out of nowhere, and an ending that adds to the rawness and seemingly authentic nature of the film as this supposed true account. I keep using the word raw, and I think that's because it so perfectly encapsulates how this film is presented. Raw, rugged, gritty, and real. As I've said before, this film feels more like a documentary depicting actual events than any standard Hollywood fare, and raw is simply one of the best words you can think of to describe it. From the previously mentioned cinematography itself, to the gripping original score, if you can call it a score at all, to the unnerving sound effects, the believability of the main characters, or the nightmarish portrayals of the Sawyer family members themselves, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is truly a tour de force when it comes to not only horror movies, but cinema itself. I can still recall that first time ever seeing Leatherface show up on screen, just being frozen in place and just mute, horrified, holding my breath, unable to truly comprehend this skin-wearing madman before me. And this feeling and memory has never left me, always in the back of my mind, always giving me a slight bit of anxiety whenever I decide to put this movie on for another rewatch, knowing full well everything there is to know about the movie, about what a nice guy Gunnar Hansen was, to how awesome of a person Jim Sedow was, to how much Marilyn Burns went through on this film, may they rest in peace, to everyone else involved in the movie, both on screen and behind the scenes, both living and dead, with not a stone unturned as far as the film's production goes. It still gives me the creeps every time I watch it, and it still, somehow, feels like I'm watching an account of true events rather than a work of complete fiction, and that says something about the quality of this picture, and surely accounts for much of its longevity with horror fans and fans of cinema worldwide. With that said, I just want to take a moment and give it up for one of my favorite horror directors of all time, and absolutely a hero of mine, and an inspiration for me when it comes to cinema. The man, the myth, the legend himself, Tobe Hooper. Rest in peace, sir. Rest in peace. When it comes to the Chainsaw Massacre franchise, this is the holy grail of the series, as it should be. I love this movie, and as much as it horrifies me and gives me anxiety, I can't help but cherish this film. One of the greatest horror movies ever made, if not the greatest. It introduced the world to the Sawyer family and Leatherface, one of horror's greatest icons, and introduced people worldwide who were unaware of it before to the existence of head cheese.
Boil it down into a big chili effect.
Now, you're probably thinking that I'm going to give this film a solid 10 out of 10, right? The perfect TobattoVision score. Of course, this movie deserves no less than a 10, am I right? But I'm not going to give this movie a 10. For the first time on TobattoVision, I'm going to give a film the highest rating possible, beyond a 10 out of 10 masterpiece, beyond the rating scale. The pinnacle of horror movies, Tobe Hooper's The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, is a crystal skull.